Let's talk about climate change. I'm going to talk about the fear of climate change, and that's a downer part. I'm also going to talk the hope that I have about climate change, and maybe at the end of this 10-minute talk, it'll be less of a downer talk. So let me start with the basics. I think you're all familiar with this. Just want to make sure we level set here. Over the last 2,000 years, humanity has had a very steady amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The Industrial Revolution comes along about 200 years ago. We build a global economy that produces incredible prosperity in terms of food and housing and transportation. We've created this modern miracle, but there's a catch, because that modern economy is all based on emitting greenhouse gases. And the problem with that, of course, is that as greenhouse gas concentrations go up, the planet is warming. This is the greenhouse effect. It's very well understood and known. And we see that in the last 3 years are the 3 warmest years in the history of modern humans. And in fact, last year we breached the 1.5 degree mark. In other words, we are now 1.5 degrees Celsius warmer than we were historically, using the baseline of 1850 to 1900. But when it comes to climate change, the past doesn't really matter. What really matters is the future. Where are we headed? Because that's where the problem lies. And when we look to the future, we can make all sorts of predictions. First of all, what future would be ideal? Well, the climate scientists tell us, many of whom work here at Columbia University, they're very clear about this. The science is very clear. If we want to avoid any risk of catastrophic climate change, we need to keep warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. In other words, where we are today. And the only way we can do that is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to zero, or what's called net zero, within the next 30 to 50 years. And this has been the objective of the Paris Agreement, politicians and policymakers and scientists for several decades now. This is not going to happen. We are not going to keep things to 1.5 degrees. In fact, the moment where we're headed is a warming of more than 2 degrees, but 2.5 to 2.9 degrees Celsius. That's the direction we're headed today. So what does that mean for us? What's that future of 2.5, 2.9 degrees look like? Well, it's not good. First, in some parts of the world, for example, parts of India, we're already seeing temperatures in the spring get above 40 degrees Celsius, well above 40 degrees Celsius today. That's over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And this starts to get beyond the human survivability index. In other words, people will not survive there. They'll have to move. We'll have a greater migration problem that we're going to have challenges in parts of the world to live. We're going to see more intense storms. Why is that? Because most of the heat that's been accumulated, this warming, is actually not in the atmosphere. It's in the oceans. The oceans absorb most of the energy in the warming. And when storms are created in the Atlantic and other oceans, what they're drawing on the energy in the water. They're taking up the heat that's in the oceans. As the oceans warm, there's more energy, more violent storms. We're starting to see that in the southeast and the south U.S. That trend will accelerate. There'll be more powerful storms in our future. We will see more wildfires, more intense wildfires, not because it's hotter out there, it's only a couple degrees hotter, but because when it warms, forests get drier. They dry out with a couple degrees. And when they dry out, they become tinderboxes and you get fires. Like we saw in LA, of course, the Palisades fire, a very costly fire to the economy and to the people there. But in fact, that was a very small wildfire. The big wildfires are going to be in Canada and other places that have enormous forests that are drying out. So we're going to see increasing wildfires. And if you really want to talk about fear, we need to think about what I call tipping points. Tipping points are when there's a change in the natural environment that's abrupt, and once it happens, it's almost impossible to reverse it, and it leads to further changes in the climate. An example of this, and there are many potential tipping points out there, I just show you one, is the permafrost. So permafrost is permanently frozen land in northern Canada, northern Russia, and that land stores enormous amounts of methane. It's frozen vegetative matter from millions of years ago in some cases, or sometimes just a few thousand years ago. But it's frozen. That's great. Leave it frozen. As the planet warms, that permafrost thaws. As it thaws, methane gets released. Methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas. That leads to further warming. Further warming, more permafrost melts, more methane released. That's a tipping point. That hasn't happened yet, but 2.5 to 2.9 degrees Celsius, the risk of tipping points becomes much greater. So we have a lot to worry about when it comes to climate change and our future if we're heading down a path of 2.5 to 2.9 degrees Celsius. But this talk is about fear and hope. What's there to be hopeful about? Well, let's start with the fact that we sit here in a business school, and the area I specialize is in climate finance. And the first thing I'm hopeful about is the amount of finance, or specifically investment, that is going into climate solutions. We recently started investing more capital in clean energy alone, mostly renewable energy, than in all fossil fuels everywhere on the planet. Coal, natural gas, oil. We now pour more money into solar, wind, and other clean technologies. This is a dramatic change. The amount of capital flowing globally has increased dramatically. And while politics will affect that, certainly here in the US in the next couple of years, the trend is very, very clear. A lot more capital is going to solutions. Why is capital going into these solutions? You'd say, well, because of climate change. Not exactly. It's going to these solutions because they're innovative. The amount of innovation that's happening here is extraordinary. Number one, solar. Solar is one of the great inventions of modern humanity. The cost of producing electricity from solar has declined 99.9% in the last couple of decades. This incredible accomplishment to the point where producing electricity from solar is now the cheapest way of generating power on the planet. And as a result, the amount of solar and wind that's generating electricity today is the fastest growing source of power generation on the planet. Let me put this in context. When I got involved with climate change, which is now more than 2 decades ago, we go back to 2001 when I got involved. And if you took every solar panel on the planet and added them all together, they produce as much electricity as one coal-fired plant. Today, globally, we install as much solar in 12 hours as one coal-fired plant. Every 12 hours, we're replacing a coal-fired plant. So this is a remarkable innovation, and it's changing the trajectory of energy generation on the planet. Another example of innovation, of course, is batteries. A colleague of mine at the engineering school said, I never knew batteries could be so sexy. Turns out they are, because batteries allow us to have electrified transportation and to use renewable energy to drive our transportation. And the cost of batteries is also coming down remarkably, because that's resulting in a dramatic increase in electric vehicles. Last year in China, which is the largest automobile market in the planet, more than 50% of all new cars sold in China now are electric vehicles. There's an incredibly fast transition happening from the internal combustion engine to the electric vehicle. Why? Because the innovation around these cars. These are not just cleaner cars than traditional gasoline-powered. They are better cars. They're faster. They're more fun to drive, cheaper to operate. Enormous innovation there. If we move from power and transportation, the areas that are probably well known, to the area of industry, there are now thousands of companies with thousands of innovations under development today. And many of these are going to be enormously successful in the future. I'm not saying they're all going to be, and many of these companies, of course, will fail over time. But you've got companies working on things like green hydrogen, green steel, producing steel without greenhouse gas emissions. You've got enhanced geothermal. Enhanced geothermal is leveraging existing technologies in the oil and gas industry, fracking, to generate clean, almost anywhere on the planet that's cheap. And I was meeting with a venture capitalist yesterday to discuss this sector. This sector may become as large as the solar sector in the next decade. You have other technologies, basic things like cement, which is now increasingly green or low-carbon cement, to high-tech technologies like fusion. The world's leading fusion companies here in the US. The CEO came and spoke here recently, Commonwealth Fusion. So you have an incredible amount of innovation going on, and that gives me hope, because when I started in this sector, not only was solar a tiny little solution, none of this innovation existed then. We knew the science of climate change 20 years ago. We knew the problem. We didn't have the solutions. So where does that leave us? How do you pull together this fear and hope that I've just expressed? How do you balance these two? Well, let me summarize this. The challenge we face, as I started my talk with, is that we spent 200 years growing this global economy, this extraordinary thing we've created. We now have about 30 years to decarbonize that economy. We need to figure out how to have economic growth and decouple it from greenhouse gas emissions. That's the only path that's feasible going forward. Okay? Can we do that? Can we balance that fear and hope? And it turns out we already have examples of doing so. One example is the United Kingdom. The UK economy decoupled back in the 90s. Okay? And I picked that as an example, not because they're the only example or the best example. The UK economy hasn't grown tremendously in the last couple of decades, but it has grown significantly. And emissions, absolute emissions, these are not per capita emissions, absolute emissions have gone down. I picked the UK because this whole problem started in the UK. The Industrial Revolution started in the UK. They were the first to burn coal. And they did something amazing. In 2024, they burnt their last ton of coal to produce power. There's no more coal-fired facilities in the UK. And their economy continues to grow. Okay, that's great. UK is not such a big economy. Can we in the US decouple greenhouse gas emissions from economic growth? Is that possible? Well, it's a trick question. I like trick questions for my students in class, right? It's a trick question because we already did it. We had decoupled emissions and economic growth starting in 2007. The US economy has grown very dramatically in that period, and emissions have actually declined in that period. Okay? Not fast enough to avoid the climate challenge we face, but there is a clear decoupling there. So the last point I'll make is what's happening in the US and the UK and many other countries is good. It's not good enough. But it's also not the most important region. The most important country by far when it comes to climate is China. 1/3 of all emissions in the world today are from China. So where's China in all this? China has not decoupled. China's emissions have gone up every year except when there's something weird happens to the world, like COVID. With the COVID crisis, the economy drops emissions. You see that on the slide. But something might be about to change in China. The early data, and we're not sure about this data yet, but the early data suggests that Chinese emissions peaked last year. This would be an incredible thing, because if China's emissions finally peak, in other words, they finally decouple, they still have economic growth, but their emissions start to drop, then you've finally got the last big country emitting, starting to get on the path to decoupling their economy and addressing our change. So where are we headed? We're not headed to 1.5 degrees. We're going to warm more. I also don't think we're headed to 2.5 to 2.9 degrees and the catastrophic scenarios I'd explain. I think we're somewhere in the middle. Because of the innovation, because of the investment, because of what's happening globally, we're probably going to be somewhere around 1.8 to 2.1 degrees. That's not a great outcome. That's not even a good outcome. But it's definitely a manageable outcome, and that's probably the future we're facing. Thank you very much.